Joan of Arc once said she didn't want to go to war. She would have rather stayed in the village with her mother, spinning yarn and making clothes. But God called upon her to fulfill her duty of liberating France, and she wasn't going to run counter to the will of God, even if her personal aspirations clashed with the divine mission laid before her. As an atheist, the story of Joan of Arc really fucks with my head. I'm surprised Christians don't use her story more often to convert people to their cult. Joan of Arc's trial by the English when she was captured in 1430 detailed much of her life and thoughts, as she was forced to give an accurate account to her English accusers to determine if she was a heretic. She seemed to come out of nowhere and perform feats that come across inhuman, almost as if it was divine intervention that gave France Joan of Arc in their most desperate hour of need. Many theories about what Joan was experiencing have floated around over the years. Was she truly a messenger sent from the god? Or was she just a mentally unstable nationalist that inspired her men because she was a little girl accomplishing feats that even the average man couldn't? The truth about Joan of Arc was simple. She was a girl in a man's world doing what men were supposed to do better than they could. And there's nothing more threatening to a man than a woman who can do it better than them. And that's why the English lit her ass on fire for it. I hear it to many women who donned her iconic bob cut as a sign of women's liberation, and a villain to the English at the time that condemned her as a heretic. Joan of Arc's story to me is a story of will, persistence, and compassion. And ultimately her life is a tragedy cut short by the patriarchy of the time. And yes, I do feel sorry for her. She was only 19 when she was brutally burnt alive by the English. 19. Poor little baby girl. If God is real, then it means he robbed her of her free will and played her like a fiddle. Yeah, I don't think I believe that, if this is how we allowed a child to be treated. But I've gone way too ahead of myself. Let's rewind back, like all the way back. Joan of Arc was born in the year 1412 in a village in northern France called Domremy, amidst the 100 Years' War between England and France, which lasted from 1337 to 1453.
Which actually it makes it 116 years.
Whoever named this war can't fucking count. I bet he was English. Now, the 100 Years' War was not one continuous conflict that lasted more than 100 years, but was really 3 wars. Thus, the 100 Years' War is more of a time period than one individual war. The Lancastrian War was the final phase of the 100 Years' War, and it's probably the most notable of the 3 phases because it produced figures like Henry V, who has a movie on Netflix, and Joan of Arc, who this video is about. Now, Henry V restarts the hostilities with France because he believed he had a claim to the French throne, because his great-grandfather, Edward III, in 1337, believed that he had a claim to the throne, because his mother, Isabella, was the sister of the King of France, Charles IV. When Charles died, he had no male heirs, so his cousin Philip VI of the House of Valois took over as regent. And eventually, since no male heirs to Charles IV could be produced, Philip VI was crowned king, much to the objection of Edward III, who started the war with France to claim their throne. Henry V in 1415 revived this dispute and invaded France. The key English victory would be at Agincourt, which left the French gates wide open for England, and they would spread across all of northern France, taking major cities like Paris and Reims, where all French kings were crowned since the days of Clovis I, who was their first king in 509. The English were also assisted by an anti-Valois faction of French people called the Burgundians. The Burgundians traded with the English for wool, since English wool was the best in Europe, and the Burgundians had the best drip in Europe. So they killed their own people for clothes. My oh my, how we haven't changed at all in 600 years. Joan of Arc's village was in Burgundian territory and was frequently attacked by them. Thus the town began to voice their support for the Armagnacs, who were a political party in France, who supported the French crown and were antagonistic to the English and Burgundians. Now, I must state that I read Mark Twain's personal recollections of Joan of Arc, which is a fictional retelling of her life, with the major events being entirely accurate. It's narrated by a fictional character called the Sieur Louis de Conte, or as I like to call him, the Cunt. Oh wait. I almost forgot all the fucking French names I'm going to pronounce, and all the gens. All the fucking gens that were involved in Joan of Arc's life that I had to read and completely forget who they were because there were 10 million other gens I had to remember, making all this a nightmare to research. And yes, I did give up paying attention to all the Jeans making an appearance. Why the fuck would you do this, French people? Jean. This is just ridiculous. I don't understand why they would do something like this. Okay, I'm lying. I do know why they did this. Jean translates to John in English, and we all know a million Johns or Johnnies. But these French names never quite did it for me. If you want to talk about some sick-ass names, go no further than the Roman Empire. Ladies, you wonder why men are so obsessed with the Roman Empire? It's because the names fucking slapped. Scipio Afra motherfucking Canis, Marcus Aurelius, Gaius Octavius, Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius.
There's no way we went from that to Jean.
Whack.
Anyways, I hella digress. So pretty much, Mark Twain was infatuated with Joan of Arc. So much so that he wrote himself into the story as the narrator, but went a step further and made himself a fictional character that knew Joan from childhood and chronicled her life as he shared in her quote-unquote adventures. That's how much he loved Joan of Arc, that he made himself her male secretary in a story where he could have just been a warrior alongside her in the Siege of Orleans that killed the most English that day. But no, he made himself her male secretary. Now, in no way is Mark Twain's account of Joan of Arc the most historically accurate retelling of the story, but it was highly entertaining, and it wasn't the only research I did. As I'm about to continue, we'll see how Mark Twain's flagrancy with Joan of Arc's story is on full display, and by no means do I think he approaches it in a disrespectful manner. Quite the opposite, really. But there is an element of literal magic in his version. So, during Joan of Arc's childhood in Domremy, there was a magical tree that existed for hundreds of years that all the children of the village played around. But it wasn't because the children loved the tree, they loved what it housed. Fairies. Like Tinkerbell. The children for hundreds of years throughout the existence of Domremy would play with the fairies, but then one day the church decreed that all fairies were banished from appearing before the children of God, as the fairies were children of the fiend, or devil. The children of Domremy were heartbroken, but they would still in secret visit the fairies while the adults weren't watching. But then one night, one of the villagers stumbled upon the fairies when they were drunk and partying in their tiny homes. The villager told the local priest, Père Front, and he had the fairies banished from the village. And upon this, the children wept further. The only person that could have stopped the banishment of the fairies was little Joan of Arc. Not even in her teens yet, however. She was sick in bed and could not attend the spectacle, but when she recovered and learned of what happened, her wrath was only matched by the armada of God's angels let loose upon the battlefields of Armageddon. Okay, not really. She's a small child. If the wind blew, she'd fly away. But she was upset with the priest, as all children should be with any priest. She approached the priest saying, "The fairies were to go if they showed themselves to the people again, is it not so?" "Yes, that was it, dear." "If a man comes prying into a person's room at midnight when the person's half naked, will you be so unjust as to say that person is showing himself to that man?" "Well, no. Is a sin anyway, even if one did not intend to commit it?" "Oh, my poor child, I see all my fault." As the conversation continues, it seems the priest is ready to admit his wrongdoings, in full, to Joan. But then he tries once more to convince her of his rationale. "Then the matter stands like this. They were barred creatures of fearful origin. They could be dangerous company for the children. Now give me a rational reason, dear, if you can think of any, why you would call it a wrong to drive them into banishment, and why you would have saved them from it. In a word, what loss have you suffered by it?" "Oh, father, how could you talk like that? Who owns France?" "God and the king." "Not Satan?" "Satan, my child? This is the footstool of the Most High. Satan owns no handful of its soil." "Then who gave the poor creatures their home?" "God. Who protected them in it all those centuries?" "God. Who allowed them to dance and play there all those centuries and found no fault with it?" "God. Kinsmen of the fiend? What of it? Kinsmen of the fiend have rights, and these had, and children have rights, and these had, and if I had been there, I would have spoken, I would have begged for the children and the fiends, and stayed your hand and saved them all. But now, oh now, all hope is lost. Everything is lost, and there is no help no more. Poor little creatures, What can a person's heart be made of that can pity a Christian child and yet can't pity a devil's child that 1,000 times more needs it since salvation was barred from them? She stormed out, leaving the priest speechless. He said to himself, "Ah me, poor children, poor fiends. They have rights, and she said true. I never thought of that. God forgive me. I am to blame." Not only was Joan of Arc a saint and a badass general, which I do understand is contradictory, but she would have made a great lawyer too, apparently. Joan was a peasant who lived with her mother and father and 4 siblings, one sister named Kathryn, who was older, and 3 brothers named Jacquemin, Jean, and Pierre, because of course they were. They tended to the animals, worked the land, and farmed. This is how they made their money, and almost all their earnings were taxed by Charles VI. This was made more trying by the constant assaults from the Burgundians, who destroyed their means of income through burning, looting, and killing. Seeing these events firsthand obviously caused the unresolved trauma that plagued Joan of Arc's short life. But despite the unwarranted savagery that surrounded Joan, she was known by her family and peers as a genuine good person with an absolute pure heart. Now, is that part of the romanticization attached to her story, seeing as how she is a national icon and garners the reputation of a saint? Absolutely. But based on her trial, there is no question that she was a good person. One day, a prisoner of Domremy broke out and began threatening the villagers with an axe. Joan then appeared before him, and he lowered his axe, and Joan escorted him back to his cell. When the villagers gathered around Joan to figure out how she accomplished such a feat, she responded saying, "You make a great thing of it, but you mistake. It was not as if I had been a stranger to the man. I know him. I have fed him through the bars of his cage many times, and last December, when they chopped off 2 of his fingers to remind him to stop seizing people passing by, I dressed his hand every day till it was well again." Not only did she treat all humans as equals, but all animals, mostly herbivores, felt her all-encompassing magnanimity. She would take food from the kitchen and feed it to her wild friends, much to the disapproval of Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc. But her mother convinced Jacques to leave Joan be. Animals would tell their forest friends that Joan was a friend, and best of all, she had food. She called them her pets, but refrained from giving them a collar, as they were free to come and go as they pleased. French soldiers would stop by the village to see if they could receive food, supplies, medical attention, and other ailments to their woes. This is how the family and Joan would be updated on the war if the guest was allowed to stay. In 1415, when Henry V invaded France and defeated them at the Battle of Agincourt, King of France Charles VI signed the Treaty of Twain, which disinherited his son Charles VII and made Henry V of England regent and heir to the French throne. Then we get to 1422, and this is a wild year. Both the English and the French kings die, and Constantinople is besieged by the Ottomans, who eventually win the siege. The son of Henry V, Henry VI, inherits the throne, but he is just an infant. So Henry V's brother, John Duke of Bedford, is made regent. Now, because much of the major cities in the north are captured by the English, Charles does not have the ability to crown himself the king, so he is in open retaliatory conflict with England. When Joan's family and the rest of Domremy learned of the Treaty of Twain, they expressed bewilderment at such a gross violation of France's dignity. Jacques d'Arc was the first to be angered by the news. He was outraged that France and Charles VI would surrender to the butcher of Agincourt, Henry V. Henry V also had taken one of Charles's daughters as his queen, Kathryn of Valois. Joan's father expressed even greater anger at her and called her a traitor, despite the fact that she had no choice in the matter. One day, a Burgundian priest came to the village with a whole entourage of soldiers to burn, loot, and kill. The crazed prisoner that Joan had extended her mercy to was hacked to pieces like a slaughterhouse animal by the soldiers. As the pillaging was happening, the priest stood atop the church steps and declared that Charles VI was dead, and all should pledge allegiance to the infant king, Henry VI, and all the instability of France would be corrected by the House of Lancaster, the house that Henry V and his son Henry VI belonged to. The mob of angry Domremies were hurling insults at the priest and declaring him a traitor, but none of the insults were so scathing as what Joan had said. "I would I might see thy head struck from thy body, if it were the will of God." I say something stupid, but even I don't have the words for such a badass line. Joan and her family were finally experiencing what the rest of northern France was enduring: killing of their livestock and families and burning of their properties by the English and Burgundian thugs, all while their taxes were still being imposed upon them, and they had to pay up regardless of what precarious situation they were in. Joan said, "Paying taxes with not to pay them with is what the rest of France has been doing these many years. But we never knew the bitterness of that before. We shall know it now." Later on, when Joan was asked by her peers if she could ask any favor of the Dauphin, Charles VII, if she were to serve in his army, she said, "If the Dauphin out of his grace and nobleness should say to me, now that I am rich and am come to my own again, choose and have, I should kneel and ask him to give command that our village should never more be taxed. I'm beginning to like her more and more already. So now we move on to the most controversial event in Joan of Arc's life that has elicited endless debates. Her visions. When Joan was 13 years old, she received her first vision in her father's garden. A bright light coming from the direction of the town church shone at her, and a voice pierced through this light, declaring itself as the Archangel Saint Michael, the commander of God's armies. He was accompanied by two other angels, Saint Kathryn and Saint Margaret. They told her that God had chosen her to lift the siege of Orleans and crown the Dauphin, Charles VII, as King of France, finally expelling the English out of the country. What's interesting is that the siege of Orleans wouldn't take place until October 12th, 1428. Now, the voices didn't initially tell her about Orleans when she was 13, but when she was 17, a few months before the siege happened, her voices told her that she would be the key instrument in lifting the siege. I don't know if this is true. According to her account in her trial, she knew about Orleans before it was under siege, so if this is true, I have no way of explaining this from a rational standpoint. Scholars and medical professionals have examined Joan's condition and landed on three possible answers. One is epilepsy, which can cause visual hallucinations when seizures of the brain are localized in the temporal lobe, which could explain the bright lights she was witnessing, and the church bells within Joan's village, which were highly prevalent in medieval Europe, could have been the trigger. However, these symptoms don't account for the voices Joan was hearing during the visions. The second illness could be schizophrenia, which would explain the voices and the hallucinations, but if she did have schizophrenia, it doesn't explain how high functioning she was. Even though she was illiterate, Joan was able to have an understanding of battle plans and was able to master horse riding and sword training. If the schizophrenia was so prevalent, she really shouldn't have been able to function, considering she had her visions frequently and claimed to be able to summon them at will. Also, Charles VII's father, Charles VI, was medically insane and everyone knew it. His father would lay on the floor for weeks because he believed that he was made of glass. Charles VII knew what true insanity was, and he didn't believe Joan had it. But also, Charles VII was not a medical expert, so his opinion in the matter is as promising as a modern-day podcaster. Lastly, tuberculosis. Some scholars theorize that when Joan was young, she drank unpasteurized milk, as many peasants and farmers did and still do today. The bacteria from the milk could have disseminated through her body and reached her brain and temporal lobe, causing seizures and then leading to her famous visions. Some of Joan's contemporaries have said that Joan was very thin and looked ill many times through her life, and TB could be a reason for this. But Joan was also said to be very fit and able to perform physical feats that someone with TB would not be able to accomplish, as her body would be quickly deteriorating, leading to a very non-active life, which was the total opposite of Joan. So overall, no one really knows what Joan had, or if she had any debilitating diseases at all. Maybe she made it all up to get where she needed to be. Maybe she was just a patriot who was willing to fake it till she made it, to free her country and her people from the English, like so many other people have tried to do through the long history of English persecution. And maybe the English made up the visions during her trial to make it seem like she was possessed by demons, and the whole transcript was fake. But that doesn't make much sense either, considering there are so many first-hand accounts of people who did know each other, who all gave the same description of the trial. And their family records can be traced, and we know who they are. So Joan's trial is well documented from multiple first-hand sources. Me personally, I do think something told Joan what she wanted to hear, and the movie with Mila Jovovich explores this in a creepy way. A specter comes before Joan when she is captured by the English and questions why she did what she did, and she claims God told her to do this. But when the entity gets Joan to keep asking why she was doing what she was doing, she realizes it's because she wanted to free France and claim glory, not because God wanted it for her, but because she wanted it. However, this contradicts my opening quote where Joan just wanted to be with her mother, perfecting her craft as a seamstress. People are multifaceted and want things in their life that are contradictory. They want to be millionaires, but then claim to be socialists. They want to be capitalist, but then claim to be compassionate.
The United States is a compassionate nation. We are proud that we do more than any other country anywhere in the world.
Boy, if you don't...
They want to eat healthy, but also want it to taste as good as junk food. I'm not saying Joan is like any of these people. In my opinion, she's far better than any of them. But like all other historical figures that we must curb our expectations for, Joan of Arc is no different. In 1428, when Joan turned 16 years old, her visions told her to go to nearby Vaucouleurs to speak with the governor Robert de Baudricourt, who would give her an escort to Chinon to meet with Charles VII. She told her uncle Laxar to go with her, and when she reached the city, she requested an audience with Robert, which she surprisingly was granted. Joan told him of her divine mission given to her by God and how she was the only hope France had at kicking the English out of their beloved country. Robert scowled at Joan, saying she was but a child. He burst out into laughter along with the entire court, with some saying she was demented and her mind was a wreck. Robert told Laxar to take Joan home and beat her, suggesting that this was the only cure to her ailment. Joan responded by saying, "You refuse me the soldiers, I know not why, for it is my lord that has commanded you. Yes, it is he that has made the command. Therefore I must come again, and yet again. Then I shall have the men at arms." And come again she did, and Robert continued to refuse her. She then took up residence in the city, and this is where her legend was kindled. More and more citizens began to hear of Joan, especially many women, who saw her as an inspiration against patriarchal societal norms. She then received visions of the Battle of the Hearings, which was a skirmish outside of the besieged city of Orleans, and she told Robert, "In God's name, Robert de Baudricourt, you are too slow about sending me, and have caused damage. Thereby, for this day, the Dauphin's cause has lost a battle near Orleans, and will suffer yet greater injury if you do not send him to me." Today, child? Today? How can you know what has happened in that region today? It would take 8 or 10 days for the word to come. "My voices have brought the word to me, and it is true. A battle was lost today, and you are at fault to delay me so." Several days after, word had reached Robert that the Battle of the Hearings was indeed lost, and now he believed Joan, while simultaneously being completely freaked out by Joan's clairvoyance. He gave her 6 armed escorts to take the 11-day journey to Chinon, and this is where Joan claims her voices told her to cut her hair like a man and don men's clothing to not attract unwanted attention. From here on, Joan would don the iconic bob cut that became a symbol of women's liberation. Now all this begs an interesting question. Did Joan do this because her voices told her to do it? Or did she actually prefer wearing men's clothing to women's clothing? I guess if you could ask her, she would have said because she was doing a man's job, it was best to look the part, as many of her contemporaries agreed with her. But there have been some suggestions that Joan might have been gay or trans, contrary to what conservatives and many bigots would have you believe. Trans people have always existed through human history. Many African peoples before Christian European colonization practiced what we would consider today homosexuality and transgenderism. Women would take on men's roles if they were infertile, and men would take on female roles and marry men. I know this is going to upset a lot of people, and you're going to ask for various sources about my claim. However, that would completely distract from this video, making it 10 times longer, and I could make a whole video about the topic, but this is a military history mythology channel. But if transgenderism and queer people are something you believe popped up in the 21st century, you need to read more, simple as that. Joan's desire to don male clothing could also stem from her strict father and conservative upbringing. I don't doubt Joan's faith. I do believe that she believed in the Christian God to the fullest, but she was still a teenager with hormones. When she told her father that she was going off to fight in the army to free France, he was enraged. He said he would have her brothers drown her, and if they couldn't do it, he would do it himself. He believed that she wanted to go prostituting among soldiers because that was the only reason, besides cooking, that women would accompany soldiers. This type of psychotic overprotection is usually what leads kids, mostly girls, to rebel against their parents, leave home, and start an OnlyFans when they turn 18. In Joan's case, it was fighting a war. Interestingly enough, she would sleep close to her fellow soldiers and never expressed any sexual or romantic desires towards any of them, which could indicate she was gay. As far as we know, Joan of Arc was a virgin, so it's hard to make a judgment about her desires. Christians watching this will say she 100% had no desires, but I call bullshit. Everyone has desires, like most of you closeted conservatives. In short, I think Joan donned men's clothing to fit in and prove she was just like them. But there's always answers beneath answers. She was deeply conservative and didn't seem to support sexual liberation. So it is a little ironic to use Joan of Arc as a symbol of modern sexual liberation when she wasn't a fan of prostitution or foul language. She told every soldier in her camp that if they took a prostitute, they would have to marry them. Granted, it's unclear if this rule was enforced by her. So, Joan finally reached Chinon, and when she got there, Charles VII decided to play a little game with her to test her divinity. He hid himself among his court, and Joan had to figure out who among the court was Charles VII. Astonishingly, she picked right, and knew who he was, leaving the whole court dumbfounded. He then had a private conversation with her, and this is where she revealed the visions and voices in full detail to him, thus convincing him that she was a pawn of divine providence. However, he knew his supporters and soldiers wouldn't just accept her, and she needed to prove herself to allow her in their circle. Her chastity and knowledge of the Bible was tested, and she passed. The way in which they proved her virginity was invasive and just creepy, to be honest with you. They had a nun prod around and she found no signs of penetration. Lastly, a Dominican from the Order of Dominica, which was founded in the early 13th century to root out heresy, questioned Joan. "You assert that God has willed to deliver France from this English bondage." "Yes, he has willed it." "You wish for men at arms so that you may go to the relief of Orleans, I believe." "Yes, and the sooner the better." "God is all-powerful and able to do whatsoever thing he wills to do. Is it not so?" "Most surely, none doubts it." "Then answer me this. If he was willed to deliver France and is able to do whatsoever he wills, where is the need for men at arms?" He thought he was cooking with that one. "He helps those who helps themselves. The sons of France will fight the battle, but he will give the victory." The court's conclusion was as follows. "It is found and hereby declared that Joan of Arc, called the Maid, is a good Christian and a good Catholic, and there is nothing in her person or her words contrary to the faith, and that the king may and ought to accept the succor she offers, for to repel it would be to offend the Holy Spirit and render him unworthy of the heir of God." The court rose and the audience surrounded Joan in congratulations. She had won over the king, the court, and the people. Her sharp wit and unquestionable faith delivered her the army and position she requested. She was made a general by divine order, and Charles had steel plate armor made for her. Also, her voices told her of a sword hidden near the altar of St. Kathryn. She sent a squire to retrieve it despite protests that she wouldn't find it. But of course, I think you already know how this story is going. The sword was there. Lastly, she had a standard which indicated where her army should rally when they were dispersed in the heat of battle, a pennon which showed where she was on the battlefield, and a banner which was used for prayer among her and her men. She is quoted saying, "I love my banner 40 times better than my sword, and when I went against my enemy, I carried my banner myself, lest I kill any. I have never killed a man." And now, Joan was ready to face the meat grinder at Orleans. So now we get to the most famous battle that created the legend Joan of Arc. The battle that legitimized her in the face of her doubters and proved she was chosen by God to liberate France from the yoke of the English oppressors. The Siege of Orleans. But first, some light politics. When Henry V died in 1422, he named his brother John Duke of Bedford, or John Lancaster, guardian of the French realms, and his nephew, young Henry VI, until Henry VI was old enough to rule. Philip the Good of Burgundy was to be regent of the taken territories in France. However, he didn't want this responsibility, and John Lancaster took up both roles as regent and protector of England and France. He had quickly become one of the most powerful men in Europe, and he was determined to fulfill his late brother's dream of the Lancastrians' rule over all of France. Much of the north had been taken, but now the south remained, and standing in the way of that was the city of Orleans, which needed to be secured if the invasion of the south was to commence. He enlisted the help of Thomas Montague of Salisbury to take the city. Before establishing Orleans, Salisbury took several forts and towns that surrounded Orleans to establish a supply line. The siege began on October 12, 1428, with Salisbury attacking with 4,000 English soldiers and 1,500 Burgundians sent by Philip the Good of Burgundy. They attacked key access points and blocked off the city. However, this was no easy feat considering where Orleans was. The Loire River ran at the front of the city, providing it with a natural barrier. A bridge ran across the river, was connected to a huge fort called the Tourelle, which is where you would need to attack if you wished to first establish a garrison and invade the city. Orleans was defended by an estimated 6,400 troops and 3,000 armed citizens. Salisbury bombarded the French troops defending the Tourelle with cannon fire. The 100 Years' War was the first European war which used gunpowder. The French were bombarded for 2 days straight, and then Salisbury attacked with his troops, driving the remaining French across the bridge into the city. Salisbury now controlled the Tourelle. But on the 27th of October, Salisbury was killed by a cannon fired by a French soldier's son accidentally while he was playing with the cannon. Hey, I don't make the history, I just tell it. Half of his face was ripped off and was left looking like Gustavo Fring from Breaking Bad. Later on, 500 French troops led by a man named Jean de Dunois, aka the Bastard of Orleans, got into the city and took command of the situation. He was named the Bastard of Orleans because he was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Orleans, who was captured by the English in 1415 at Agincourt. After Salisbury's hilarious death, William of Suffolk and John Talbot were put in charge, and unlike Salisbury, they decided not to attack and instead began the siege by building bastilles or garrisons around the city to stop anyone or anything from getting in or out. However, northeast of the city there was a huge gap, and Dunois was able to receive supplies and manpower from this gap. It's funny they spend all this time building various bastilles to surround the city, and they think no one will exploit the gap that they leave because most of the easier access points are blocked off. But a great fighter knows if there is a weakness, regardless of how inconvenient it is to exploit, still do your best to capitalize on it. And that's exactly what Dunois was able to do. Charles VII received word about the situation at Orleans and sent a relief force of 4,000 men, led by Charles de Bourbon. Simultaneously, English commander John Fastolf sent from Paris carried a supply of herrings from the English at Orleans, accompanied by a host of 1,600 men, 1,000 archers, and 600 foot soldiers. The two opposing armies met outside the city, and Fastolf realized that his convoy was terribly exposed, and they could be cut to pieces by the far superior numbers of the French. He formed a rounded defense with 300 wagons, with the archers safely protected inside, but still able to accurately fire at the enemy with their deadly British longbows, which were infamous at Agincourt 13 years prior. But Bourbon had an ace up his sleeve and blasted the English wagons with cannon fire, spilling herrings all around the battlefield, giving the battle its name, the Battle of the Herrings. This is the battle that Joan's voices told her about, that convinced Robert de Baudricourt to give her the armed escort to Charles VII, and if you're paying attention, you'll know how this battle turns out. The Scottish who fought with the French. Oh yeah, during the 100 Years' War, the Kingdom of Scotland was on the side of the French against the English because of the old alliance pact signed in 1295, which meant if either were attacked, they would come to each other's aid. If you're wondering why Scotland hated England, just watch Braveheart. But sadly, the Scots at the Battle of the Herrings disobeyed Bourbon's orders to not attack and charged at the fortified wagons, only to have English arrows rain down on them. As the Scots were retreating, the French tried to cover them, but then English foot soldiers cut them to pieces. The English won the Battle of the Herrings, and Fastolf was able to get the remaining supplies to the English at their bastilles. Now, peace negotiations were being proposed, and Philip the Good of Burgundy was eager to end the battle. But John Lancaster was not the surrendering type, and he still believed the city would fall. Philip the Not-So-Good relieved his troops from Orleans, putting Lancaster in a slightly precarious situation now that the French were able to receive more reinforcements. But this time, a certain someone was on her way, ready to fuck everybody's shit up. On April 30th, 1429, Joan of Arc arrived with Jean II, Duke of Alençon. Another fucking Jean, and they just walked into the city with no one raising an alarm. Worst siege ever. I see why they lost. When Joan arrived, the people knew who she was, and the people's spirits were lifted along with Jean II of Alençon, bringing more supplies for the people who were starving. Now, Jean and Jean want to... God fucking damn it! Now, Jean and Jean want to take a more so-called pragmatic approach. They want to hold out and starve the English surrounding the city. But Joan and another French general that greatly supported and believed in her named La Hire.
Good to see your ugly damn face again.
La Hire, I'm warning you. Don't swear.
Sorry, Jean.
Wanted to take a more aggressive approach and go out and meet the English in their bastilles head-on. On May 4th, 1429, the French commanders at Orleans received intel that John Fastolf was sending reinforcements to the English at the Saint-Loup Bastille. The Bastard of Orleans and the Maid of Orleans rode out to attack the Saint-Loup Bastille, even though the intel they got was faulty and no reinforcements were actually coming to the English. 1,500 men, led by Joan of Arc, climbed up the ladders and killed every English in the way and took the Saint-Loup Bastille. Now this raises the question, why were the French given faulty information, and why did it work out better than they could have anticipated? Was it divine intervention? Did Joan have a hand in this? Or maybe it was just simply faulty intel. Regardless, it feels odd that throughout Joan's life, these random coincidences occur. So now that the Saint-Loup Bastille fell to Joan, supplies were flowing freely into Orleans. But the siege wasn't over yet. Joan and Dunois crossed the Loire River to attack the Saint-Jean Bastille. But when the English garrison saw 4,000 angry Frenchmen charging at them, they literally ran away to the Saint-Augustin Bastille, which was the closest to the Tourelle. On May 6, Joan and Dunois took the St. Augustine Bastille. However, Joan took a crossbow bolt in her shoulder close to her neck while scaling a ladder. She was rushed to a med tent but quickly recovered and returned to the battle the next day to the astonishment of everyone. And with the countless divine interventions surrounding this girl, she took the St. Augustine Bastille on May 7th. Now, all that was left was the Tourelle. And just like a video game, they saved the hardest shit for last. Joan lifted her banner atop a trench and said to her men, "Watch, when you see the wind blow my banner against the bulwark, you shall take it." The French climbed the walls of the Tourelle, killing every English soldier in sight. They eventually threw down their arms and some tried to retreat on the bridge, but the bridge collapsed under the weight and many English drowned in their heavy armor. Joan had done it. She had lifted the siege of Orleans in 7 days while the siege was going on for 7 months. However, the Bastilles north of the city across the river were still standing, and John Talbot challenged the French to open combat in the field, but both Joan and Jean de Dunois looked at each other and laughed and told Talbot to come out and get them, but he wasn't about to contend with the unbeatable peasant girl from Domremy, who just handed the nobility their own pale English ass on a silver platter. John Talbot and William retreated, leaving their men and Bastilles behind, thus conceding defeat. The siege was broken. Joan of Arc had won a great victory for the French. Now, Charles wanted to be crowned in Orleans because he thought it was safer instead of Reims, which is where the first king of France, Clovis I, in 509 was crowned, and all of France's kings were crowned since. But he was too pussy to go into English territory, so Joan decided to carve a path for him to Reims. The battles that followed Orleans would be known as the Loire campaign. She would go on to win a series of victories with her generals, Dunois and La Hire. The final victory would be at the Battle of Patay on June 18th, 1429. Before this battle, however, Joan prophesied that France would strike a blow to the English so hard they will not rise up in France for 1,000 years. The English strategy for the battle was simple: get their longbows to a high position and at the base defend it with long pikes to deter cavalry and infantry. John of Talbot found a hill near Patay and began building his fortifications there. On the French side, Joan told her commanders to leave the infantry behind and continue with the cavalry to speed things up. La Hire led the vanguard, and he noticed a deer appear from the forest while they were traveling on the road. Then suddenly an arrow pierced the deer and Englishmen came out from the trees in a celebratory fashion. This is when La Hire knew that the English were close by. He ran down the English hunters and then proceeded through the forest until he was in an open field, and he noticed the English archers on top of the hill. But they hadn't had the time to set up the pikes at the base of the hill. La Hire charged with his numerically inferior numbers at the archers and crashed through their lines. Then the main French army led by Joan of Arc mopped up the rest. That in Mortal Kombat is what we call a flawless victory. This was one of the greatest British military defeats in their long history, and it was thanks to Joan, who knew the importance of speed, which allowed her army to catch their enemies off guard while they were still setting up their defenses. After the victory, Joan looked at her generals and said, "Oh friends, do you know? Do you comprehend? France is on the way to be free." Later on, there was a wounded English prisoner who was mortally wounded by the French. He was too poor to pay the ransom required by the French and was likely going to die. Joan approached the prisoner and held him in her arms, and she did her best to comfort him with soft words as tears ran down her cheeks, and the English prisoner then died in her arms. On the 17th of July, 1429, the Dauphin, Charles VII, was crowned King of France, with Joan of Arc standing by his side. Joan of Arc, a small peasant girl in a patriarchal world, accomplished a feat that no one thought possible. Charles thanked Joan and gave her grand royal titles and her own property. He then asked her further what she desired. "O gentle king, if out of your compassion you will speak the word, I pray you give commandment that my village, poor and hard-pressed by reason of war, may have its taxes remitted." "It is so. Say on." "That is all." "All? But that is nothing. Less than nothing. Ask, do not be afraid." "Indeed, I cannot, gentle king. Do not press me. I will not have aught else, but only this alone." Charles was stunned at the humbleness of Joan. I guess success and reward vary depending on where you are on the class structure. If Joan was a noblewoman, would she have desired more? Probably. But there was one more thing Joan desired that even the wealthiest individual could relate to. She wished to go home, now that her divine mission was accomplished. She missed her mother, her brothers and sister, and yes, even her psycho father, who said he would have her brothers drown her if they couldn't do it, he'd do it himself. But unfortunately, Joan would never see her parents again, as Charles denied her request and wanted her to continue battling the English. So much for ask and you shall receive. He knew Joan was strategically important. Her victories and divine support boosted the morale of the troops, and Charles needed this now more than ever. Joan was too valuable of an asset, but behind the scenes, he was scheming along with his court, which many of whom held contempt for Joan as she was usurping their influence towards the newly crowned king. Joan was now in more danger than ever before, and she wasn't even on the battlefield. It's always the politics that screws over the poor and working class people. After the coronation, Charles VII and Philip the Good of Burgundy negotiated a peace for 15 days so control of Paris would be given to the Armagnacs. But Philip in secret wanted Charles and his army to lower their defenses so he could take more territory. Joan, along with Jean II, Duke of Alençon, attacked Paris with 10,000 troops, which was an unbelievably bold move. However, the attack was a disaster, and Joan took a crossbow bolt to the leg and had to be dragged off the field at night when the fighting died down. Charles refused to send more troops, and he pretty much abandoned Joan, which is insanely fucked up since it was him who wanted Joan to keep on fighting despite her protest to return home. He didn't want to upset his standing with the Burgundians, and he also knew that the Parisians supported the English and wouldn't side with their own countrymen until it was guaranteed that English support was no longer beneficial to them. Joan was furious with Charles and his constant pussy behavior. She gave him the crown, and now he was expressing unbelievable amounts of ungratefulness. The man was truly a weasel, in my opinion. Joan would continue to fight and win smaller victories at places like Saint-Pierre-les-Mortiers, and Charles granted her noble status for this victory. But in March 1430, the French court learned that Philip the Good had betrayed them and was going to attack them at Compiègne. Joan set out with 400 men and arrived at the city on the 14th of May 1430. The commander of the city was a man named Guillaume de Flavy, who was on some fucking Prophet Muhammad type shit and married a 9-year-old girl. But don't worry, she later got tired of his ass and had him fucking murdered 10 years later. Joan set out to meet the attacking army, which was close by, but her troops were quickly overwhelmed, and she tried to retreat to the city, but as she was about to get in with Burgundians hot on her trail, the doors to the city closed, and she was taken off her horse and captured by the Burgundians. A fucking locked door defeated the great Joan of Arc.
Hey! Who locked the fucking door, huh? I don't like locked doors around here! They make me crazy and shit! I was locked up and shit!
Now this raises the question, why did Flavy the Pervy lock the fucking door? Was he paid by the English or Burgundians, or even by someone in Charles's court, or by Charles himself? No one knows, but I think it was a joint effort by all these entities that conspired to capture Joan of Arc and remove her from the picture. Joan was moved around from place to place by the Burgundians, and eventually she was held in a tower at Beauvoir, but attempted to escape by literally jumping out the fucking window, almost falling 100 feet. She was knocked unconscious and was injured, but recovered from her injuries. Now, Joan knew that suicide was a sin, so there's a sense that Joan almost viewed herself as invincible and thought that she would have survived the fall and been able to escape. The English would eventually pay for her ransom, set at 10,000 francs, and she would be put on trial at an English-controlled French city called Rouen. Her judge was a man named Pierre Cauchon, who greatly supported the English and hated Charles VII and all those who aided in his ascension to the throne, which meant Joan of Arc was public enemy number 1 to him. From the start, it was guilty until proven guilty for Joan of Arc. While all this was happening, Charles made no attempts to rescue Joan or pay her ransom, which in my mind means that he was at the very least abetting in Joan's execution. The first order of business was to determine if Joan was a virgin or not. Again, she had the same invasive treatment by the English. The determiner was the Queen Regent of England and France, Anne of Burgundy, who found nothing. Next, Nicholas Bailey was sent to Domremy to ask about what Joan was like as a child. What were her habits, and was she truly a pure Christian woman? He found nothing to discredit her, and Cauchon declared Nicholas a traitor and a bad man, and he even denied him his promised salary. What a petty princess. The trial had 15 sessions, with 6 of them being in court and the other 7 being held in private in her cell because Joan was making the accusers look stupid with her quick wit and stubborn demeanor. The first 3 sessions asked her mostly questions about her life in Domremy. The fairy tree is brought up and Joan refused to call the creatures demons or evil. The court used this to charge Joan with witchcraft since it was believed those who associated themselves with creatures that weren't believed to be of God's children were devil worshippers. So moving on, the court asked Joan, "Do you know whether or not you were in God's grace?" This was a trick question, since the church said no one could know if they were in God's grace. But if Joan had answered no, then the judge could have said she admitted to being in a state of sin. One of the assessors protested the question, saying it was too serious a question, meant to trick Joan. Even Cochon responded to Joan by saying, "It would have been better for you if you had kept your mouth shut." Joan responded if she was in a state of sin, she didn't think these saints would come to her. Now, the one that really upset everyone the most was, why did Joan wear men's clothing? This was absolutely abhorrent to the establishment at the time, as it does state in the Bible at Deuteronomy chapter 22 verse 5, "The woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all that do so are an abomination unto the Lord thy God." This was the only hard evidence they had against Joan. Everything else was either hearsay or unsubstantiated claims. During almost all the sessions, this issue was brought up the most. When asked why she did this, she told the court because God had told her to. Cochon asked Joan if the angels spoke English, and Joan answered the question with another question. Why would they speak the language of the enemy? She was playing with fire, and she was going to get burnt. When asked why she left her parents at such a young age, she said God permitted it. When asked why God had chosen her to liberate France, she said it pleased him to see someone so small accomplish so much. The court later determined that Joan was not visited by St. Michael, St. Margaret, and St. Kathryn, but instead it was Satan and his minions, which is a completely arbitrary assumption. Joan finally had some fiery words for Cochon. "You say that you are my judge. I do not know if you are, but take good heed not to judge me ill, because you would put yourself in great peril, and I warn you so that if God punish you for it, I shall have done my duty in telling you." Joan later states that St. Kathryn had told her, "Take everything peacefully, have no care for thy martyrdom. In the end, thou shalt come to the kingdom of paradise." The regular trial for Joan was on the 26th of March, and 70 articles of indictment condensed down to 12 were drawn up. The charges were read to her in French, and she finally broke and admitted to all of them to save herself from the fire. No matter how tough you are, being burnt alive is the worst thing next to being dismembered alive. Now, the cell she was being held in was not guarded by nuns, and she wasn't allowed to attend mass. Instead, she was guarded by soldiers who threw sexual threats at her, and this was one of the reasons she continued to wear men's clothing to deter her guards from taking advantage of her. On May 28th, 1431, Joan rescinded her admission and said the voices told her to recant her admission of guilt, and she also said Cochon had denied her from attending mass, even though he said that if she admitted to her crime, she would be given this grace. But Cochon had not kept his word, so she refused to keep hers. Joan, from the time she first received her visions in Domremy to the time she was captured and tried, was completely headstrong and laser focused. It almost did seem as if she was possessed, and Mark Twain makes this claim, saying when she had her visions, it almost appeared as though she was in a trance. But once the so-called relapse occurred and the fire is before her, she can't bear it and breaks down. A priest approached Joan's cell and said softly, "Joan?" She looked up, then, with a little start and a wan smile, and said, "Speak, have you a message for me?" "Yes, my poor child, try to bear it." "Do you think you can bear it?" "Yes." "I am come to prepare you for death." A faint shiver trembled through her wasted body. There was a pause, then she said, still in that low voice, "When will it be?" "Now. The time is at hand." "It is so soon. Ah, it is so soon. What death is it?" "By fire." "Oh, I knew it. I knew it." Tears were now flowing down her face uncontrollably. She began to look around for help and friendliness, but her fate was sealed. "Oh, cruel, cruel to treat me so. And must my body, that has never been defiled, be consumed today and turned to ashes? Sooner would I that my head were cut off 7 times than suffer this woeful death. If I had the promise of the church's prison when I submitted, and if I had but been there and not left here in the hands of my enemies, this miserable fate would not have befallen me. Oh, I appeal to God, the great judge, against the injustice which has been done to me." Cochon was now happier than ever. He had finally condemned the enemy of England, the 19-year-old who turned one of the most powerful kingdoms on its head, and worst of all, she was a girl. All this bullshit about fairies and men's clothing were all nonsense. The real reason Joan of Arc was tried was simply because she was a woman doing it better than any of the men could, which made them look very stupid, incompetent, and insecure. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc, the hero of France, the girl who stood in the face of the patriarchal society that told her she was insane and couldn't become more than what society had intended for her, only to prove them all wrong, was burned alive at the stake. Her charred remains were displayed to the public in the Rouen marketplace, and then burnt again to ashes and scattered in the Seine River. Upon her family learning of her violent execution, they worked tirelessly to prove her innocence and exonerate her. Charles VII knew that he couldn't fully be legitimized as a king because he was associated with a heretic, so he opened two inquiries, one in 1450 and another in 1452. Both inquiries concluded that Joan was judged by a kangaroo court that was only concerned with proving her guilt. The court was corrupt and biased, and one of the biggest red flags was when they moved her trial from public to private, for no real reason other than Joan was making them look stupid. In 1456, Joan of Arc was fully exonerated of all her crimes, and her sentence was overturned. The French and Burgundians signed a peace treaty in 1435, and they abandoned their alliance with the English, and the French would go on to win the 100 Years' War in 1453, with Charles VII still king until July 22nd, 1461. The peasant girl from the farm village of Domremy had freed France and won the century-long conflict that involved grey kings and men in shining armor. It all ended by a teenage girl who overcame every obstacle thrown at her. There isn't a story more inspirational, and in 1920, she was sanctified by the Catholic Church and is now known as Saint Joan. Remember her, the maid, Joan of Arc. Jean.